A glass fortress reflects the icy sky. CEO Olivia Grant, radiating corporate coldness, steps from her sedan. Her driver, Daniel, opens the door with silent precision. She smirks, a flicker of pity in her eyes. "Just drive, Daniel. Stay in your lane." Arrogant directors laugh at the man in the cheap suit. 40 minutes later, inside the boardroom, a $1.5 billion merger is dying. One mistranslated word, one cultural insult, and a lethal silence falls. The deal is vanishing. Suddenly, the invisible driver walks in. He speaks, not in English, but in the partner's most sacred native tongue. The game changes. Daniel Park was a man built on layers of quiet, meticulously curated precision. At 45, his entire universe had been compressed into two distinct, non-overlapping worlds: the leather-scented, sterile interior of a luxury sedan, and the small, brightly lit bedroom of his 11-year-old daughter, Sophie, where the air smelled of crayons and old books. To the bustling, caffeine-fueled corporate world of the city, Daniel was nothing more than a shadow in a black suit. He was an invisible force, a human GPS, whose only purpose was to ensure that CEO Olivia Grant arrived at her high-stakes meetings exactly 3 minutes early. No more, no less. He was just the driver, a man whose silence was often mistaken for a lack of intelligence, or worse, a lack of ambition. Olivia Grant, 38 and brilliant, was the storm that Daniel navigated every morning. She was arguably the most ambitious woman in the global tech industry, a leader who saw the world through a cold lens of binary results, quarterly growth, and aggressive acquisitions. To her, Daniel was a reliable tool, an asset with a fixed contract, no different from the high-speed fiber internet in her penthouse office or the private jet she used for cross-continental trips. She had never asked about his past, never wondered why a man with his level of focus and unwavering composure was content sitting in gridlock traffic for 8 hours a day. She never noticed the way he listened to international economic broadcasts in 4 different languages when he was waiting at the airport, his eyes sharp with understanding, or the complex geopolitical journals tucked away in the glove compartment, hidden under a stack of city maps. But Daniel Park had a history that could fill libraries. Before life had forced him into the driver's seat, he had been a high-level logistics coordinator for a global shipping giant, a man who moved mountains of cargo across continents with the stroke of a pen. His career had been a whirlwind of international movement, living in the neon-lit, sleepless streets of Seoul, the industrial heart of Berlin, the desert luxury of Dubai, and the disciplined, silent corridors of Tokyo. He spoke 9 languages fluently, not out of a desire to brag or climb the social ladder, but because in the brutal world of global logistics, a single mistranslated word could mean the difference between a successful delivery and a multi-million-dollar disaster. He knew that language wasn't just about grammar. It was about the soul, the pride, and the unspoken rules of the person speaking them. Everything changed when his wife, Elena, passed away 5 years ago after a brief but devastating illness. The high-octane life of international travel, constant jet lag and midnight conference calls in different time zones became an impossible, hollow burden. He looked at Sophie, then only 6, and realized he was becoming a stranger to his own child. He needed stability. He needed to be the one to pack her lunch, to hear the mundane details of her school day, and to tuck her in every single night without fail. So he traded his executive office for a commercial driver's license. He took a job that most of his former colleagues would consider a humiliating failure. He became a chauffeur, finding a strange meditative kind of peace in the anonymity of the front seat. On this particular Tuesday, the pressure within the car was palpable, vibrating like a live wire. The interior felt smaller than usual as Olivia sat in the back, her fingers flying across her iPad with a rhythmic, aggressive tapping. This wasn't just another meeting. It was the final negotiation for a $1.5 billion merger that would define her legacy and secure her company's future for the next decade. The partners were a formidable group, a United Nations of industry titans coming from 3 different continents, each bringing their own baggage of cultural expectations. While English was the agreed-upon language for the summit, Daniel knew the hidden dangers of global English. He knew that when pride and billions of dollars are on the table, people often retreat into their native logic, even when their mouths are forming English words. As they sat in heavy, suffocating traffic near the bridge, Olivia barked into her phone, her voice sharp and frayed with stress. She finally hung up, threw the phone onto the seat, and looked at Daniel's calm reflection in the mirror. "Daniel, make sure you stay with the car after you drop us off at the tower," she said, her voice devoid of even a hint of warmth. "I don't want to be waiting even a second when this deal is done. We'll be heading straight to the airport for the victory press conference. I have a global audience waiting. Do you understand? No coffee breaks, no wandering off." "Understood, Ms. Grant," Daniel replied softly, his voice a calm, steady anchor in her sea of chaos. His eyes met hers in the rearview mirror for a fleeting second, a moment of profound clarity, but she had already looked away, distracted by a new, urgent notification. He wanted to tell her that the Brazilian partners she was meeting valued a slow, warm buildup of personal trust over her fast-paced, cold slides. He wanted to warn her that the Japanese delegation would find her directness aggressive and disrespectful rather than efficient. But he remained silent, his hands gripping the steering wheel at 10 and 2. He was just the driver, and in Olivia's world, the driver didn't have a voice. The black sedan glided to a halt in front of the towering glass monolith that served as the financial district's beating heart. Waiting on the sidewalk was a phalanx of young Ivy League directors, all wearing slim-fit suits that cost more than Daniel's car. They were the brightest minds of Olivia's firm, groomed for success and entirely disconnected from the realities of the world outside their glass offices. They carried themselves with a peacock-like arrogance, their laughter loud and performative. As Daniel stepped out to open the door, his posture was impeccable, back straight, movements fluid and dignified. He adjusted his modest but perfectly clean suit jacket, a relic from his previous life that still fit him like a glove. One of the junior directors, a man named Marcus who prided himself on his people skills and aggressive networking, leaned toward a colleague and whispered just loud enough for the sound to carry through the crisp morning air. "Look at the chauffeur," Marcus sneered, a smirk playing on his lips as he checked his gold watch. "The guy looks like he's heading to a Victorian funeral. Maybe he's mourning the death of his own career. Imagine waking up at 45 and realizing your greatest achievement in life is knowing how to use a blinker correctly. It's pathetic, really." Olivia stepped out of the car, catching the tail end of the comment as she smoothed her skirt. She didn't reprimand Marcus. She didn't even look at Daniel. Instead, she let out a short, dismissive chuckle that cut deeper than any insult. "As long as he drives well, stays quiet, and keeps the interior smelling like fresh leather, he's doing exactly what he's paid for," she said, her eyes already on the building's entrance. "Let's focus on the billions, Marcus, not the help. People like Daniel are invisible for a reason." Anand, they swept into the building, a whirlwind of expensive perfume, clicking heels and high-velocity ambition, leaving Daniel standing alone by the idling car. He didn't flinch. He didn't tighten his jaw. The insult didn't sting because he knew a truth they were too young and too arrogant to grasp. That true power doesn't need to shout, and true intelligence doesn't need to belittle others to feel tall. He checked his watch, leaned against the fender, and watched the city breathe. He felt a familiar tightening in his chest, the same feeling he used to get before a massive logistics launch in Singapore. He had a feeling today would be the day the glass tower shook. Inside the 35th floor boardroom, the atmosphere was a stark, jarring contrast to the bright sunshine outside. The international partners were already seated, a formidable row of executives who looked like they were carved from granite. There was Herr Bogle from the German conglomerate, a man who valued precision, historical data, and direct eye contact above all else. Beside him was Mr. Sato from the Japanese tech giant, whose silence was not a void, but a weapon of careful observation. Across from them was Senor Silva from the Brazilian infrastructure firm, a man who looked for the vibe and the heart in every contract before he looked at the numbers. Olivia began her presentation. She was a force of nature, articulate, fast-paced, and relentless. She moved through her slides with the speed of a fighter jet, throwing out data points like heat-seeking missiles. However, 20 minutes into the session, the invisible wall of the language barrier began to show its first fatal cracks. Olivia's internal translator was a nervous young man named Kevin, who had a prestigious degree from a top-tier university, but had spent his entire life inside the city limits. He knew the dictionary definitions of words, but he didn't know the weight, the history, or the hidden traps behind them. The turning point came when Herr Vogel raised a complex, nuanced concern regarding risk allocation in the secondary markets. In German business culture, this was a traditional invitation to discuss a deeper, long-term partnership in mutual protection. A way of saying, I want to trust you. But Kevin, panicked by the technicality and the pressure of the room, translated it to Olivia as a sharp demand for a total liability transfer. In the high-stakes world of global finance, those two phrases are not just different, they are mortal enemies. To Olivia, liability transfer sounded like the partners were trying to dump all the potential legal failures and financial risks onto her company while keeping all the profits for themselves. It felt like a betrayal. Her reaction was instantaneous and sharp, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "We are not here to be your insurance policy, Herr Vogel," she snapped, her eyes flashing with anger. "If you wanted a liability transfer, you should have hired a high-priced lawyer to do your dirty work, not sought out a partner. This is a merger, not a bailout." The room turned ice cold, the temperature seemingly dropping 20 degrees in a second. Herr Vogel's face flushed a deep, angry crimson, his jaw locking tight. He leaned back, slowly crossing his arms over his chest, a universal sign of a door being slammed shut. Mr. Sato narrowed his eyes, whispering a sharp, hushed comment to his assistant in Japanese. The tone was unmistakable. It was a deep, stinging insult that questioned Olivia's honor. Senor Silva looked down at his papers, shaking his head in disappointment. To him, the heart of the deal had just been stabbed by American arrogance. Olivia sensed the disaster, but she didn't know how to fix it. She looked at Kevin, who was now sweating so profusely he could barely hold his pen, his face pale with the realization of his blunder. She tried to backtrack in English, but her mounting stress made her sound even more aggressive and defensive. To the partners, she didn't sound like a CEO trying to clarify a technical point. She sounded like an arrogant American bully accusing them of being incompetent or deceptive. "Perhaps," Herr Vogel said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble in heavily accented English that sounded like grinding stones, "we have made a grave, expensive error in our assessment of this firm. It appears we are not as aligned as our previous months of emails suggested. Your lack of respect for our concerns is illuminating. I believe we should pause these talks permanently. My team and I will be leaving for the airport immediately." He stood up, and like a row of falling dominoes, the other delegations followed. The deal was hemorrhaging. $1.5 billion, years of grueling R&D, and the entire future of Olivia's company and the jobs of 5,000 people were all about to vanish because of a single misinterpreted word and a lack of cultural empathy. Outside in the plush, silent hallway, Daniel was standing near the heavy mahogany doors. He had been asked by an assistant to bring up a fresh set of revised documents from the car, and through the slightly ajar door, he had heard every word. He heard the mistranslation. He heard the insult. He heard the death rattle of a billion-dollar dream. He thought about the engineers in the lab, the secretaries, the warehouse workers, people like him who needed this deal to survive. He didn't think about his job security. He didn't think about Marcus's cruel insults. He took a deep, steadying breath, adjusted his tie, and did the unthinkable. He pushed the doors open. If you believe that a single right word at the right time can change a billion-dollar destiny, subscribe now to see what happens when the driver walks into the lion's den. The chaos inside the boardroom was absolute and deafening. Olivia was pleading for a 10-minute break, her voice bordering on frantic as she followed Herr Vogel toward the door. She turned to her assistant, her face a mask of panic. "Get me a senior interpreter, now! I don't care what it costs. Charter a helicopter if you have to." Ma'am, the nearest agency says their senior staff is stuck in the same traffic we were. They are at least an hour away, the assistant stammered, looking like he wanted to disappear into the carpet. We don't have an hour. We don't have 5 minutes. They are leaving. Olivia hissed, her hands shaking as she watched the Japanese delegation begin to pack their leather briefcases with clinical efficiency. That was when the heavy mahogany door swung open fully. It wasn't an executive, a lawyer, or a high-priced interpreter who stepped in. It was the driver. The young directors at the back of the room looked ready to explode. Marcus stood up, his face contorted with rage, pointing a trembling finger. Daniel, what the hell are you doing? This is a private executive session. Get out of here and wait by the car before I have security throw you out of the building. Olivia stared in stunned, wide-eyed silence, her mind unable to process why her chauffeur was standing in the center of her greatest professional failure. Daniel? Not now. Please, not now. Just go. I can't deal with this too. Daniel didn't look at Marcus. He didn't even acknowledge Olivia's plea. He walked with a calm, predatory grace directly to the head of the table and stopped exactly 2 feet before Herr Vogel. He didn't look like a driver anymore. He looked like an ambassador. He bowed slightly, a perfect, disciplined, 45-degree gesture of respect that made the Japanese delegation stop in their tracks. Entschuldigen Sie bitte die Störung, meine Herren, Daniel began. His voice wasn't the quiet, submissive tone of a servant. It was calm, resonant, and carried a weight of absolute authority that instantly sucked the air out of the room. He didn't just speak German. He spoke the high-level, rhythmic, and highly technical dialect of the European industrial elite. He didn't announce his presence or brag about his skills. He simply began to deconstruct the wreckage of the last 10 minutes. Herr Vogel, Daniel said in German, his eyes locked onto the older man's. If I may offer a humble clarification, Ms. Grant's reaction was not born of greed, but of a linguistic shadow. In our language, the specific term used by the interpreter implied a lack of fundamental trust. It suggested a liability dump onto a victim. However, having lived in Frankfurt, I know that your request for risk allocation was an invitation for a solid Gemeinschaft, a community of solidarity and shared burden. She was not rejecting your partnership. She was defending the integrity of the very work she hopes to do with you. She was, in her own way, being as direct as a Berliner. Herr Vogel's eyes widened, his hands freezing on the handle of his briefcase. He looked at Daniel, then at Olivia, then back to the driver. The crimson faded from his face, replaced by a look of intense analytical curiosity. He recognized that accent. It wasn't from a textbook, it was from the boardroom. Daniel didn't stop to let them breathe. He pivoted toward Mr. Sato. In flawless, formal Japanese, utilizing the precise, ancient honorifics that only someone who had lived and worked in the heart of Kyoto for years would know, he addressed the silent insult. He explained that Olivia's directness was not a sign of arrogance, but a sign of makoto, a raw, unvarnished sincerity. He used a complex metaphor from the world of international logistics, comparing a corporate merger to the delicate, synchronized loading of a great vessel where every hand must know the exact weight and center of the cargo to survive the storm. The Japanese representative slowly sat back down, his expression unreadable, but his eyes now fixed on Daniel with deep respect. He exchanged a quick, hushed look with his assistant. The tension in his shoulders, which had been as tight as a bowstring, visibly dissolved. Finally, Daniel turned to Senor Silva, who was watching the scene with an amused, hopeful expression. In warm, melodic, and deeply passionate Portuguese, Daniel spoke of the coração, the heart of the project. He bridged the technical gap between shared risk and mutual growth, using specific examples from infrastructure projects in South America that he had personally coordinated a decade ago. He spoke of trust as a living thing that needs to be nurtured, not just a line on a balance sheet. The room was held in an absolute trance for the next 15 minutes. Daniel Park became the center of the corporate universe. He didn't just translate words, he translated culture, history, pride, and intent. He moved between 4 different languages with the fluidity of a master conductor, leading a world-class symphony. He simplified the legal jargon and injected it with human meaning, turning cold numbers into shared goals. He turned back to Olivia, who was standing like a statue, her iPad forgotten on the table. "Ms. Grant," he said in English, his voice returning to its respectful, professional tone, but retaining that new edge of authority. "I took the liberty of explaining that your firm views this merger as a bridge to the future, not a mere transaction. I believe the gentlemen are now ready to discuss the solidarity clause with the nuance it deserves." The lead partner, Herr Fogel, looked at Olivia and let out a long, appreciative breath that broke the silence. "Ms. Grant," he said in English, a small, genuine smile touching his lips, "you have a very unusual and very brilliant driver. If his quality and his depth of understanding are a reflection of your company's internal standards, then I believe we have much more to talk about than just liability. We have a future." The briefcases were opened. The chairs were pulled back in. The deal that had been declared dead and buried minutes ago was suddenly more alive, more vibrant, and more secure than it had ever been. Daniel quietly turned, nodded respectfully to the room, and walked out as calmly as if he had just delivered a cup of coffee. As the door clicked shut behind him, the roar of productive conversation erupted inside. The ensuing 3 hours were a whirlwind of productivity. With the cultural barriers demolished, the technical details fell into place like pieces of a puzzle. By the time the sun began to set over the skyline, the framework for the $1.5 billion deal was finalized. As the team walked back to the elevators, the atmosphere was jubilant, but the young directors were strangely quiet. Marcus, usually the loudest person in any room, kept his head down, avoiding Daniel's gaze as they reached the car. Once they were settled back in the sedan, the silence was different. Olivia didn't reach for her iPad. She didn't make any phone calls. She sat in the back seat, staring at the back of Daniel's head in the dimming light of the evening. "Daniel," she said, her voice barely a whisper, Where did all of that come from?" Daniel kept his eyes on the road, navigating the evening rush hour with his usual grace. "I spent 12 years as an international logistics coordinator, Ms. Grant. I lived in 6 countries. I was paid to make sure that people from different worlds could work together without destroying each other. I picked up 9 languages along the way. I'm not a scholar. I'm just a man who knows how it feels to be misunderstood." "Why didn't you tell me?" Olivia asked, a genuine sense of guilt beginning to color her voice. "Why are you here, behind a wheel?" "You never asked, Ms. Grant," Daniel replied simply. "And to be honest, I didn't want the title anymore. After my wife died, the world of billions felt very small compared to the world of my daughter. This job allowed me to be home for her every night. It allowed me to be a father first and a professional second. I was happy being the help because it meant I could help her." Olivia sat back, hit by a wave of profound realization. She had judged this man's entire worth by the suit he wore and the task he performed. She had laughed at his simplicity, never realizing that his simplicity was a deliberate, heroic choice made out of love and sacrifice. She had been searching for the brightest minds in Ivy League hallways, while the most brilliant man she knew had been opening her car door every morning. "I am so incredibly sorry, Daniel," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "for everything, for what I said, and for what I didn't see." Daniel caught her eye in the rearview mirror and offered a small, genuine smile. "There's no need for that, ma'am. I didn't do it to prove anyone wrong. I did it because I hate to see a good bridge collapse just because people can't find the right words to cross it." A week later, the $1.5 billion merger was officially signed in a ceremony that made international headlines. The partners sent a joint follow-up email to the board of directors. They didn't mention the proprietary technology. They didn't mention the market share. They specifically wrote about the unparalleled clarity and cultural respect shown during the final hours of the negotiation. They made one unusual request. They asked for the mediator who spoke the languages of our hearts to be present at the signing ceremony. Olivia called Daniel into her corner office. The room was filled with awards and expensive art, but today it felt empty compared to the man standing in front of her desk. She didn't offer him a raise as a driver. She pushed a contract across the table. It was for the newly created position of Global VP of International Relations. Daniel looked at the salary. It was more money than he had earned in his entire previous career. He looked at the benefits, the stock options, and the prestige. On one condition, Olivia, Daniel said, using her first name for the first time, I won't go back to the life of 80-hour weeks and constant travel. My schedule stays flexible. Sophie has a violin recital next month. I will be in the front row. No exceptions? Olivia didn't hesitate. She stood up and extended her hand. Granted. In fact, bring her to the signing. I want her to see exactly who her father is. Daniel Park didn't become a corporate celebrity. He didn't seek out the spotlight or end up on the cover of business magazines. He remained a man of quiet, powerful precision, but his position in the company and the way the world looked at him had changed forever. Olivia Grant changed too. She realized that true power isn't about the height of your office or the coldness of your commands. It's about the depth of your understanding and the humility to listen. It wasn't 9 languages that saved the company that day. It was the heart of a man who knew that every human being, whether a CEO or a driver, deserves to be understood. If you believe that character is more important than a title, subscribe for more stories like this. And tell us in the comments, have you ever discovered a hidden genius in someone the world had overlooked?